Okay, this piece of binding is cut to the proper length. The beveled end, which fits right in here, is all set to go. The only thing I have remaining to do is glue it and tape it in place temporarily. Now, I buy rolls of fairly inexpensive masking tape. You're going to read in guitar books about people who use rubber bands to hold binding on, and a lot of places like Stuart McDonald or Luthier's Mercantile will actually sell those lengths of rubber. A number of the books I've read recommend using things like strips of bicycle inner tube. It all gets pretty complex. Trying to handle a binding with wet glue, binding material that's trying to squirm out of your hand, and balancing a guitar or even putting it into a guitar vise is quite a handful. Let's put it that way. You'd wish you had 3 or 4 hands. So what I do is I'll just use masking tape. The glue does most of the work anyway if you're doing it properly. And I got this cheap masking tape, cut it into 2 to 3, or tear it into 2 to 3 inch strips. And what I'll do is I'll hold the binding in place and wrap some tape around it, hold it a little bit, and then move on. Now, what I will typically do is I will apply the binding cement to about this much to the middle of the first major curve. And you'll see it better when I start going around the corner because I don't want to move the camera, it's on a tripod. Now I've got the binding cement in there. I applied a little bead of it from the squeeze bottle, and I've now put it into place. I've got my tape, and the important thing to do is just get the first piece of tape on in the right place, and you can move on from there. The first piece of tape is kind of important. Now I'm positioning this binding a little bit proud of the surface because somehow back in the 60s when this bass guitar was built, they either had binding that was a little bit bigger, or maybe they cut the sheet binding themselves, because the groove is supposed to be 1/4 of an inch high, but in fact it's 1/4 of an inch plus about 1/2 millimeter. So what that means is that I have 2 choices. I can put it flush to the groove, in which case it's going to be a little bit short of the top, which of course will mean that we have to sand the entire top down to get it to match. And the other way is to put it a little bit proud of the top, leave a little space between the binding and the body, and fill that space with a suitable material. And that's usually the route that I will take. I can't buy binding in sheets. I can only buy it in strips, and these strips are just a tad too narrow. You can see neatness sort of counts here. I'm going to go all the way around to here with the glue. Now, a lot of people think that you have to heat binding to bend it. This is only true if you're going around some real heavy-duty curves. Curves like this, even that little horn curve that we're doing, don't require any heating. You just carefully cold bend it. And if you find that the binding is a little bit, if it's cracking or crumbling, you have some stale binding. It should be able to take a curve like this with no problem at all. Now you can see I'm drawing that cheap tape very tight, but it doesn't mind one bit. When we get into the waist of this bass, I use a few more pieces than usual because that's where the binding is at pretty great tension and we don't want a space to develop there. Pull it as tight as you can without tearing the binding. Without tearing the tape, excuse me. And now I'm going to finish applying the glue. Looks like it needs a little more here. Along that edge. Put a little more in this area. I don't care if it squeezes out, I'm going to be sanding it away. Here's an area where it didn't have hardly any glue. Or at least it didn't have enough. I'll put a little bit in there. And you can see it squeezing out. That's just fine. It sands off very easily. It sets up very rapidly. Now theoretically, I can pull this tape off within about a half an hour, and that binding is going to stay. But because the acetone that's in here, of course, dissolves the celluloid in the binding, it takes a while for the air to once again remove, or I should say, yeah, remove the solvent so that the binding hardens, because this does soften the material. So it's best to leave this before I start sanding and leveling at the very minimum overnight. And in the case of a heavy glue application where there's a lot of squeeze out, we're going to want to let it set up for 2 or 3 days till that binding gets nice and hard. There's no sense in scraping soft binding. It won't scrape. It won't hold. You'll just get this gummy area. It's like trying to scrape bubble gum. Does not work. Okay, you can see I haven't covered the whole thing with tape, but I put plenty on there. And any place where we perceive a small gap, that's pretty good. Any place where we see a small gap, we take the tape and we pull it in slightly so that we're not looking at any air spaces in there. And then when we come back and sand, we can take another look at it, and if there's a little bit of filling necessary, we've got some filler material. Now, what I meant about this was that this slot is slightly taller